Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to learn more about ARPA-H. I know that this is a field that's very much been emerging and trying to find its kind of path with and alongside the US government and how we fund. So hopefully, as Keith pointed out this morning, the emergence of a new agency that's willing to take on systematic risk, willing to take on kind of the really high potential payoff of tackling aging at its core is something that resonates with all of your interests, with the type of work that you either want to see funded or that you'd want to come in and actually shape the roadmap for. And that'll basically be the two tracks for today's conversation. You know, after understanding who ARPA-H is, what we do, what are the ways that you could work with us to receive funding as, you know, a non-dilutive funding source, but also what's the opportunity to actually come over to ARPA-H as an early employee and shape the type of research that we fund. So ARPA-H stands for the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, and that comes from another agency that many of you have heard of. I think the CEO of Maxwell mentioned it, which is DARPA. And we are trying to apply that kind of high-risk model, trying to tackle the horizon of science, 10 to 20 years out with innovation and investments today. Okay. So President Biden has really set this agency up as one of his marquee initiatives. He announced it. Closer? Okay, great. That's right, eat the mic. I did hear somebody say that earlier. So the goal of ARPA-H is to pursue ideas that break the mold on how we normally support fundamental research and commercial products in this country. And we want to go after ideas that might work if we actually put in the effort, build the infrastructure, and try to make it happen. And I think that vision is really important. And as you can tell, it's not disease specific, right? Every once in a while, he will relate diseases that many of us are aware of that are personal to our lives, like diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's. But very specifically, this agency was stood up as a disease agnostic organization to tackle innovation that could unblock a range of different scientific pursuits. Our mission is to accelerate better health outcomes for everyone. And I think both pieces of this mission are important. One, we know that science takes time, but we think we can shift that timeline significantly and hopefully get things to people faster. And there's also this focus on everyone. And I think depending on the audience, sometimes we emphasize the importance of equity in our solutions, making sure that what we develop actually is available and accessible to everyone, so practical and feasible. But ultimately, we are a science and innovation-based organization, which means we're about accelerating this research pipeline. This is a little bit, inside baseball for government, but for those of you that know NIH, I think this is actually pretty important. We are an independent component within HHS, so we sit alongside NIH, use their infrastructure, but our director reports directly to the HHS secretary. So that's really important in terms of the independence we have, the ability we have to shape research directions that can't be redundant with NIH, but are also not under the control of NIH. We have no research labs, so it's very clear we're a funder. We don't have intramural labs, and we have $2.5 billion that we have available for allocation. So a significant amount of funding to really move a select set of areas forward. We fund with contracts, not grants, and that means that you can imagine that the person on the other side of this conversation, who will be called a program manager, will be much more involved in working with you to define milestones, define metrics to measure the research. And I think that hopefully is a win-win, because along with those metrics come resources to think about transition, think about FDA, think about payment to ensure a longer pathway for that science. But it does mean there's a lot of urgency and time pressure if you're working with the organization. We can also, as I mentioned, take things forward in a transition lens by funding the FDA to actually look at things that may not have clear pathways. So we have a few unique attributes as an organization. We're very bottom up. So you hear a lot of organizations release top-down strategies that say, hey, we're going to do 40% prevention, 20% rejuvenation. We don't work that way. We really are looking for ideas that are at the right moment. If you as an individual can come in with a project or come in as a program manager, you have a lot of autonomy to then drive that program. We have accelerated contracting mechanisms. We know one of the valleys of death that companies face is that delay to get funding to advance from basic science proof of concept and discovery into the preclinical and clinical phase. And one of our kind of differences in how we operate is that we really try to condense that pipeline so that we can follow innovation and make sure that there aren't those fall-offs at critical moments. We're also very lean. We have very few layers of management, and that autonomy, that bottom-up nature really allows us to move much more quickly. And finally, for those of you thinking of coming over as program managers, we have flexibility in our hiring mechanisms. And that means that we can actually pay off of what's called the general schedule, which is how most government employees are paid. And that gives us the flexibility to hopefully bring in folks who have competitive salaries from outside of government into the government as well. We know we're part of a much broader, much more complex health ecosystem, and we see the patients, the providers, and the public as our customers. But the groups that you're all coming from, academic labs, industry, we see you as what we call performers. So the people who are actually doing the work, the folks who get the support from the government to kind of make things happen. And then we'll play an important coordinating role to bring along the other stakeholders that hopefully will lead to follow-on funding, lead to patient advocate engagement, and potentially lead to funding through other government vehicles. So this is kind of a few other attributes I want to highlight about what makes ARPA-H a different type of funding agency. The program manager, if you're interested in that route, and we'll talk more about that with Stephanie at the end, you're not coming in with the solution. You're coming in with a very well-framed problem, and that hopefully it's the right time for technology innovators to tackle. So what I mean by that is, while we expect people to kind of fall in love with their technology or their science, to become a program manager, you step back, you very tightly define this program, set metrics of success, and then the organization comes around you as a nucleus to make sure that that the program manager and then the performers are supported to deliver on that success. We're not looking for incremental advances. I think that's a refrain we've heard here at the conference. It's not about one more year or a few more months of progression-free survival. We're looking for dramatically different ways of managing and treating disease. And I think that's something that resonates, being here in an audience that is trying to tackle aging and rejuvenation at its root. I've talked a lot about the autonomy. One thing that's also important to us is that we don't become sclerotic, right? So that if you look at what we're funding now and what we're funding in 5 years, that is by nature meant to turn over. And that means that we can't be everywhere at all times. The goal is to bring in a few areas at a time, represented by each program manager, have them spend 3 to 6 years as a term-limited employee to drive that field to a new inflection point. And so that's really the question hopefully you all are asking yourself, like what is the next inflection point for the field or the subcomponent of the aging field that you're at? And can we get there with a dedicated, and the budgets can vary, but anywhere from 10 to 100, $150 million in a compressed amount of time to move the field to a point where perhaps there's more VC activity, perhaps there's more NIH activity, or perhaps there's a commercial market that simply didn't exist before. And like I said, that's by design. So we won't always be working on a given area, but when we are there, we want to work very intensely with very specific time-limited goals. This just puts it a different way. Program managers have a 3 to 6 year term. They launch programs that can go to about 5 years in length. And as the program managers turn over, the very kind of nature of ARPA-H will shift. There's a lot of different phenotypes. I think it's important that people from a lot of different career stages see the value they could bring here as program managers. We're really excited about people who like tinkering, who like seeing what's around the corner, but we're also excited about people who are frustrated, right? And that means that you've been in a field, you've seen the challenges with how it's funded, with where the field's going, and you have an idea of what could be done differently. And we want you to come here and try to make that happen. There are certain set of things that we think every program manager needs, and that is this mentality of treating the program the same way the CEO treats their company. So again, you're not just the scientific lead. You're going to understanding the end-to-end pathway to hit that next big milestone. And you hopefully have the network or can build the network of scientists and translators to do that. We want people who are curious and fundamentally technically honest, because with that autonomy comes the fact that you need to be able to set very clear milestones and be able to hold different types of organizations, leading PIs like many who are here, to account to really drive towards those outcomes. And if you fall in love with your idea, then we need those counterbalances that you kind of establish in your program structure to manage that. So like we said, we can accept people at all different career stages. The question I'd really ask is, could you imagine this person managing a $10 to $100 million research program and go toe-to-toe with strong personalities, with government officials that might be asking questions about why we fund what we do? And honestly, that maturity can happen at all different stages in your career, and that's why we're really open to that. I think many of you have probably heard of the Heilmeyer questions. These are based on a set of questions that govern what DARPA funds. And so DARPA is known for kind of taking these transformative steps, but also clearly communicating those outcomes to their stakeholders, which in their case is kind of military commanders and generals. For us, it's the American public. So we actually extended these Heilmeyer questions with questions 9 and 10, which have a little bit of more of that, how could this technology be misperceived? We don't want another situation where vaccines get to a certain level of maturity and then become a polarizing issue and become difficult to deliver. And I know that's a concern in this field as well, to think about how do you frame the innovation in aging and age-related disease so that it's accessible to everyone. But a lot of the first questions really are about the science and about the measurement. Can you be very clear about what it is you're trying to do, what health problem that relates to, how is it done today, and why is now the right time to do it? Because again, we want to be in a field in a transactional way to push it forward in a very kind of big push with the appropriate amount of funding. And then kind of questions 4 through 7 are what I'd consider more kind of project management questions. Who are going to be the recipients of this innovation? What are the risks? How are we going to manage them from a technical perspective, from a perception perspective? How long will it take? How much will it cost? So when you come to us with an idea, it's not just the problem. It's a good sense of how you're going to get from here to there, and with a budget that you can defend. And it can be an ambitious budget, because we know that's what it takes sometimes to unlock something, but it has to also be justified. We as I talked about for question 8, we keep coming back to what are the measures for success, not just at the end point, but along the way. And then how do you make sure that when this innovation progresses, it's on a pathway to broader access. So it's not just available to a small subset of the population. So these are questions that if you kind of approach us to get funding, or especially if you're applying to be a program manager, you'll see again. So this is kind of the flow of program. And I know that's a word I've said a few different times, but effectively the program manager comes in with their well-defined problem. They have to really be clear why this can't be solved in some other way. So if this is something that a venture capitalist would fund, that a component of NIH would fund, then that's what they're there for, right? And I think anytime you start up something new, the same way that a startup thinks about its value proposition, we have to be very clear what it is that's unique about why ARPA-H should tackle that problem. So once you've kind of clarified that problem, worked with supportive folks inside the agency, done market research, done technology landscaping, you'll define your metrics, build that into a program design, launch it, which basically means that performers or organizations will apply for funding, they'll receive that funding, potentially self-assemble into interdisciplinary teams, and then begin to execute over the course of that kind of 2 to 5 year time period. Over that time period, there'll be both support and evaluation. And what I mean by that is that there'll be clear phases to the work. Many of the programs go from 2 to 3 phases. And at each of those points, you'll have to demonstrate the evidence of progress. And the further you get, the more transformative that has to be, right? And early on, we may give you some time to put together the team, establish even a bit of basic science if required. But by the latter stages, we really want to push towards measurable outcomes that would drive the next step in the evolution of the technology. So that support would look like regulatory consulting, like other technology landscaping support. But on the evaluation side, we will use things like independent verification and validation partners. So we may even use the FDA, set them up with a lab, get molecules in to show their effectiveness. And in the process, build the regulator and that perspective into the design of the program. But all of that evaluation ultimately leads to what we call transition or graduation. Because we have these time-bound natures to our program, it's very clear that when we leave, there's somebody else on the other side to pick that solution up. And we're not going to hope and pray about that. The part of the program design is making sure that we have the transition partners there to help design the program in PI meetings alongside you all to hear the innovation happening as it goes. And that kind of facilitation is something that ARPA-H can really uniquely do to make sure that, again, science doesn't get abandoned at that critical moment when it's ready to transition. We have an entire office that thinks about that whole process, all the way from making sure that the program manager is tackling problems that have clear users, taking a human-centered approach when appropriate for things that are a bit more applied, all the way to connecting performers with SBIRs and STTR awards for small companies that are formed. And it's a very holistic way of thinking about supporting the innovator, making sure that IP positions are strong, that there's freedom to operate, that you've tackled as many risks as possible with this non-dilutive funding, so that by the time you're looking for follow-on, by then hopefully it's really just a business question that you can work out with your partner. I think these 4 focus areas are an important piece to talk through. So each of these has a very different character, and I'm going to focus a bit more on health science futures and proactive health for this audience, but happy to talk more about the others. So the Health Science Futures Office is all about platforms and new ways of kind of breaking down barriers in research. So it's asking, what is that future of how science is done, and can we accelerate that today? So it might be new methods, it may be new platform technologies, and it's really not disease specific, which I think plays, again, to the strength of this community. We also have an office called Proactive Health, which it's what we've heard of different philosophies today, is more about reaching people before they've started incurring all of that damage, before they're in an acute disease state, and asking what can be done to both identify risk, but also characteristically, or go after the characteristics that will reduce that risk for those individuals. So as you think about ideas and alignment to the agency, I would think about, are you trying to unblock research, or are you at that point now where you can make a case that you can diagnose things much earlier from a biomarker perspective, or push for innovations that fundamentally reduce risk and likelihood of mortality. Our other offices focus on things like scale up. How do you think about making things available to all different geographies, going from something being given in an infusion center to the home, and how do you make the health system itself, which has a lot of data that doesn't interoperate, has a lot of siloed components that don't work well together. Are there technical and operational solutions to those barriers as well? So interesting from a delivery perspective, but maybe a little bit less so this group. So there are several ways to partner with us, and I think we'll talk more about this with Stephanie, but for now, the key element is coming in through the open broad agency announcement. This is somewhere that we basically allow you to say, which office are you aligned with? What's your big idea? Put it together into a short white paper. Don't spend too much time. This is not a 50-page NIH application or anything like that. It's a 3-page abstract to communicate the idea, see if it's a good fit for ARPA-H as it is now, and then you'll get that signal back that would evolve into a full proposal development if there's that fit. You can become a program manager, so join us. We're trying to grow quickly. We really want to get a broad range of different perspectives in the door now to shape how we grow and make sure that we don't settle for something that's not ambitious. And then as your institutions, you may be able to apply to be part of or become partners to what's called our hub and spoke model. So part of the way that we're trying to ensure the translatability of what we do is actually doing that groundwork to establish a network of hospital systems, of trial sites, so that when something does show promise, we can very quickly generate the evidence and the acceptability data that you might need to take it to scale. So you can engage more through that QR code. Now I'm just going to walk through a couple programs before we transition to Q&A. So Keith mentioned Nitro. This program's currently not open for application, but there will be an award announcement in the coming months. So the NITRO program is focused on tissue regeneration, tackling specifically osteoarthritis from both a bone and a cartilage regeneration perspective, trying to make a kind of a step change from putting a piece of metal on somebody's body with an invasive procedure to a minimally invasive approach. But one thing that I think is particularly interesting is that there's also an openness to systemic approaches. And I think that is, again, a good intersection with the audience here today. We just announced the Precision Surgical Interventions Initiative. This is focused on reducing reoperation rates in cancer by ensuring that the margins are clear after a surgery and avoiding damage to healthy tissue. So there's a lot of technology innovation happening here to try to move away from an off-site pathologist to being able to do in vivo characterization of cancer cells at the margin, as well as smart surgical instruments that can detect and avoid healthy tissues like nerve in the process of these surgeries to reduce kind of collateral damage. Finally, I think this is an image that our director shows often. What we think of as impossible today, a few years ago, what we're living today seemed impossible to folks back then, right? So there is a lot of hope, and I think that's what drives ARPA-H as an organization, and I think drives many of you, and we're hopeful that you'll kind of come to us with ideas either through our project process through the Open BAA, or hopefully joining our team as one of our early program managers. But thanks for your attention, happy to answer questions, and hopefully talk to many of you afterwards during the sessions.
Thank you so much. All right, let's take a seat. This is really, really exciting. I have been following ARPA-H since before it really launched. Yeah. I started reaching out to everyone on LinkedIn. It's like, can we talk, please? And here you are. So I'm beyond thrilled. Everyone in the back, please don't be shy. There are seats up here. Come on up. No one's going to stare. Just come on up. Come on. All right. So anyways, lots of questions. Before I kick off with my questions, I'm curious, do we feel like, did you have a big understanding of what ARPA-H was and what the opportunities were before Arunan did that presentation? Are people generally surprised and excited? Like, what were the reactions? Yes? Okay.
Does it feel like it's a good fit for the community? Okay, good.
I think this community in particular is excessively cutting edge, and we're struggling with the fact that nature, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is a perfect opportunity for synergy. Before I also dig into some questions about this, you wanted me to ask you about the Presidential Innovation Fellowship. Can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, so while I'm mostly here on behalf of ARPA-H, I think it's also important to note that, government does have a lot of different ways in. And I think sometimes people see going to government as a one-way street, right? But one opportunity that I found has brought really great talent into the organization is the Presidential Innovation Fellowship. So if you take a look online, we have an annual cycle. A lot of people hear about it and then kind of come back to it a few years later in their career, but it allows you to embed alongside a strategic leader to really do something meaningful. So one of my opportunities was to sit with Tara Schwetz, who was standing up ARPA-H as she was getting feedback from the public to understand, what's the gaps that NIH can't handle. And I've had other colleagues go on to help, redesign, how we serve veterans through our websites and services, how we reach women and children who have kind of inadequate nutrition. So there's really high impact opportunities. And it really is just a one-year commitment with an option to renew. So it's a great chance to kind of come over to the other side, see how government works, maybe go to an NIH or an ARPA-H and see what funding looks like before coming back to your kind of private sector career.
Any follow-up questions on the fellowship before I move on? Okay. And also, we'll get your contact information in case you have any follow-ups. So I'm going to go a little bit out of order because there are a lot of different topics that I would like to cover. But let's just start off with something a little bit specific. So to avoid stagnation, for example, PMs will serve a limited term. But how is continuity of leadership ensured on projects that last longer than the original creator, for example?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think the way that our director describes it, it's a feature, not a bug. So we do want this turnover not just in terms of what the organization's focused on, but even during these programs. And The reason that's the case is that, one, when you launch the program, it's pretty well defined. So you have a sense of what you're aiming for, what kind of criteria you're going to hit, and those are laid out for the incoming years. And of course, you do work interactively with the PM if that's just too ambitious or if you have a breakthrough. So when you have that turnover of a program manager, it usually is someone who has a similar background but coming from a different angle, right? So they'll still be very passionate about that area, but they may be bringing a different subject matter lens or a different discipline. And it's also helpful to kind of just bring another perspective to your program and to make sure the performers have a different type of support. So you can think of the continuity as coming from the program structure, but also the fact that there will be probably some connection to that next program manager as well. So it's not a complete kind of left turn.
So related to that question, let's say someone like a surgeon, because you do want some healthcare practitioners, is motivated to join, but because of the term and because of their inability to actually have a second job and practice the surgery, it seems a little bit of a deterrent. So how is that managed or reconciled?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that question. I mean, one is, can you have a true second job while you're in government? And generally the answer is no, both for conflict reasons and also because this is definitely not a part-time job. But it's also designed with healthcare providers in mind, and that's true for DARPA as well. So my former manager was a DARPA program manager, our first PM who launched Nitro is a surgeon. And so you are able to stay licensed. Basically, you have a few days a month that you can focus on your clinical practice so that you can maintain your certification and stay in practice. So you won't be practicing 50-50, but you will have enough time that you can set aside as a healthcare provider to maintain your licensure and continue your medical career when you leave.
Because we're going to cover a wide spectrum of questions, if you have Q&A in between about the respective inquiries, just feel free to raise your hand, okay? And James will come around with a microphone, so anytime, just raise. So how do we incentivize people to apply for this? Because it does seem that there are some lost opportunities. While it is an amazing opportunity in itself, people do have to give up some stuff, especially career scientists, for example. They have to give up their lab, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're not the first organization to run into this. I think that, the length of the term and all of that matters as well. But for folks who are in the physics and engineering space, NSF also has this sort of model where you come in generally for a 2-year term, sometimes with a renewal. And universities are pretty understanding. There's actually a government act that lets universities send folks over to government without breaking their term of contract in their former location. So it is challenging, and I think what we're really looking for are people who see a gap that can't be fixed where they are, right? So, and I think we have definitely had people with phenotype who are professors, been professors for 10 or 15 years. They can continue to mentor their students and teach, and they love that work. But they're also seeing some sort of critical barrier that from their position as someone who's just receiving relatively small blocks of funding at a time and trying to parcel that together into a vision, maybe they can't do. And having the luxury of spending 2 to 3 years focused on building a community, infusing that community with a huge amount of funding is a real kind of career capstone sort of moment. And we've seen, at least in DARPA, which has had alumni of all sorts, people can then transition back into the research lab if that's their interest. We've seen other folks who are potentially seeing innovation and have caught the entrepreneurship bug, kind of move on over into the company formation side or the VC side, or people who move on into a university administration trying to build centers around areas that they're passionate about. So I don't think that you should see this as a dip in your career. It's a shift in direction for some time, but we really focus on leveling you up. Then there'll be access to things like executive coaching, to regulatory consulting so that you understand the implications of your work. So it really should be seen as a growth opportunity with a relatively appropriate salary, like I said, higher than most government scale, and the opportunity usually to go back to your institution if it's an academic one.
And the term is 4 years?
It's a 3-year term with an option to renew if that makes sense for both your interests and your programs.
Okay. So Government agencies sometimes get criticized for paperwork and bureaucracy. ARPA-H is theoretically designed to break that cycle. How would you say it's different from the traditional systems of committees and red tapes? And how is it able to remain agile?
Yeah, so there's a few answers to that, but the one that I think most people in this room will recognize is that we're not bound by peer review. So that's something that I should have probably mentioned even during the setup, but peer review has an important place, and we know it's what drives a lot of the government funding in this country. But our hypothesis as an agency is that when you put a bunch of people who are experts in a room and have them evaluate something, it becomes a question of, well, for my field, this is a risk. For my field, this is a risk. And as you build that list up, suddenly you need a lot of data to take that next step. And that means that when you apply to even some of the more innovative mechanisms, you need to already have a pretty good sense it's going to work. And that doesn't let you take on some of the bigger initiatives that we're excited about. So instead of using peer review, we do bring along experts. I mean, we don't want to pursue things that don't have a mechanism in mind or don't have a reasoning behind them. But there's no ranking. So there's no, hey, this is 32.5 and the pay line is 30. It's just simply, as an expert, could you see this work going forward, yes or no? Right? So then the program manager gets all those yeses or nos, which are selectable, not selectable, and then they put together their portfolio. So that means that they could say, hey, I want to show some wins on the 3-year time scale, but I also think there are some things in here that probably won't work, but if they did, it would be huge, and I have the budget to try that. And that sort of ability to say, all right, what's completely ruled out, because we have the experts in the room to say this doesn't make sense, but of what's left, what's that right combination of risk that I think is going to move the field forward is really unique. And it kind of allows, one, that's many fewer layers of decision making, and two, it gives the PM ability to tackle things that you wouldn't tackle if you only got to make one award and that was your only shot. So that's from a peer review perspective. The other thing would be from a paperwork perspective. We really have a top-notch team of acquisitions and contracting folks who have seen this work at DARPA, have seen this work in other components of government, and they're under a lot of timeline pressure, which is something that your institutions will also have to get used to move quickly. So we have very ambitious goals about when we announce things, when they get funded, and then when they actually get under contract.
So just in case, I'm sure many people in this room know, but for those online, can you tell us some of the big wins from DARPA that would kind of frame or give us a reference of the types of success someone could expect?
Yeah, that's a good question because the most succinct way to put it is if you're at a program manager at DARPA and you don't invent the internet, you get a B, right? So the ambition level has to be there. It has to be something that, and maybe you don't know all of those implications when you start it, but if you go back and read, I think the Licklider memos about the internet, back then it was called the Intergalactic Network. So maybe we're not even at that level of ambition yet. But that's something that was driven by some of the early DARPA program managers. The invention of stealth within aircraft was a big win for DARPA because it pushed the field in a dimension that the industry was not going. So when it was presented to the Air Force, they said, well, we're optimizing for two things. How fast is it? And how much payload can it carry? And when DARPA came to them and said, well, we have this device, it's got some other interesting attributes, and they're like, well, how fast is it? Well, it's a little bit slower, it's like kill it, right? So that's when having that independence of having a strong DARPA director that could go to the Undersecretary of Defense for R&D to have that conversation, have somebody fly in a stealth aircraft, which isn't perfect at that point, but gives you a sense of what's possible and shows that it doesn't show up on the radar. It's like a really powerful. And anytime you're thinking about framing a program, especially if it's crazy, think about what is that aha moment that you're trying to trigger. What's that demonstration that's going to get people to say, hey, this might have been on the edge of feasible, but now I think this is possible. And then the final example I'll give is the mRNA vaccine. So mRNA is something that's been researched by a lot of government agencies. I want to give credit to BARDA, NIH, a lot of other components. But many of the early companies in that world were focused on cancer. And that's because from a financial incentive perspective, that makes sense. But we had a program manager come in who was able to make the case to these companies that actually, you can show the effect and get an interesting proof of concept much more quickly in infectious disease, and was able to deploy enough funding to kind of pivot that field and get them to run those first few demonstrations. So, which ended up, I think, saving at least months by the time the COVID pandemic happened. So those are some of the classic DARPA innovations that hopefully set the bar for the scale of what's possible, how ambitious it should be, and how early we're willing to tackle it. Because again, I think that some of the DARPA innovation was 10, 15 years ahead of when it was really broadly available to the public.
One of the things yes. Hold on, James. While James is going over to Jessica, quick, actually I forgot my question. I'll come back.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions, but I'll just start with the first one. Does it have to be a new project, or can it be something that already exists but is underfunded?
So I think the real test is, can you push something to that next level?
Okay.
Right? So there are certainly instances where there are smaller pieces of technology that maybe there's an integration challenge and maybe there's a scale challenge. As long as you can make the case, so then it really comes down to Heilmeier question 3, which is why now and what's different. Mm-hmm. So you may have to make a very strong case about, well, if you were to spend X times more, we now have these new families of measurement technologies that make a lot of things possible. We now have the data infrastructure and the research community. So I think it can fall in that category, but if it doesn't have that element of being a new and kind of paradigm shifting approach, then there's a lot more pressure on why is now the time and why are we the right partner to do it?
Sure. Okay. And the programmer or the program manager role is itself project specific, right? It's like you're the program manager for this one project.
So you actually launch one program ideally within 3 to 6 months of joining, and that should be something that you've really shaped actually as part of the application process. But then the expectation is that every year and a half beyond that you're there, you actually launch additional programs.
Okay.
So there will be an opportunity, as you see gaps in your first program, and ideally as you get to meet other colleagues who are from all different fields. You're going out doing immersion experiences to see how care is delivered, how labs might work. That hopefully your second idea is something that's inspired a little bit by your time that's at the agency.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes. James? Oh, okay.
Hi, this has been a great talk. To kind of bring it a little bit away from the longevity piece, with the advent of decentralized distributed science, we're starting to see the cropping up of distributed communities of research collectives, essentially. You made reference to the ability, the hub and spoke model, where ARPA can also integrate with entities. And so I'm kind of wondering, are there limitations to those kind of entities that it can interact with, considering the fact that when you have decentralization, you also have potential multinational components within these research collectives? And since ARPA is a government funded, or a piece of the government, of the United States government, are there limitations there?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's something I might have to talk a little bit more to my team about. But my initial sense is that, and this is based on how we frame who can receive ARPA-H funding in general, there isn't a restriction on all the funding having to be deployed in the U.S., but groups that are outside the U.S. have to have a U.S. partner or have to have a path to U.S. translation. And that's because we do have this focus on eventual health outcomes. So if we're building a lot of capacity ex-U.S. without either a route for that capacity or the output coming back here, it is kind of hard to justify from a U.S. tax perspective. But I think I would have to talk to the contracting team to understand a little bit more about what that looks like when you're starting to decentralize the ownership, or you're tokenizing things. I think that could add some interesting elements. Like, is that a partnership between a U.S. company and a non-U.S. company, or is it existing on a separate economic zone? And that would probably get tricky because I know government does not tend to be the first one over the line on some of this crypto and decentralized stuff. But the decentralized science as a whole, I think one of the big problems we hear both from industry and from FDA is we just can't do trials the way we're doing now. It's way too slow. It's way too expensive. And I think innovations there actually fit really well into our resilient systems office, which I talked a little bit less about, but I think probably has a more direct tie to the DeSci part of the crowd.
By the way, tomorrow there is a panel on, special economic development zones and all the things that are happening there. I would love for you to join, because maybe that will give some more context that you can bring back.
Yep.
I wonder if you could be more concrete or give some examples of what may be expected from us as a community working on aging. So more specifically, should we wait for some program officers to be hired that would define the program, or we could propose some ideas that might actually lead to hiring of a person, or anyway?
No, I think that is probably one of the places that we've been a little bit more opaque, so I'm glad you asked. I think we always say the most direct route is to convince a friend or a former grad student to apply to be a program manager. If it's not the right step for you, I think having that champion internally is really helpful in terms of, during the evaluation process, trying to figure out who's going to manage that effort. It's best to get a program manager here. I think that a lot of people are advocating for areas that ARPA-H should hire, but ultimately it's about what comes in the door. Who's going to actually apply? Does that person, Are they coachable? Are they able to take that idea from something that is maybe from the frame of whatever industry they're in, and then shift it over to what you need to be a program manager? So that's probably my core answer. But the other piece is that the open broad agency announcement is live, and as a new agency, we are being looked to quickly fund groups and demonstrate that speed that I've been talking about. So, like I said, it's a 3-page abstract. I think it's a relatively low risk to go ahead and just put something in and see if there's that resonance there between the agency and your interest. So I would recommend doing that. And I think the sooner the better, because we're so young, we are going to rely more heavily on that open broad agency announcement early in our lifetime. And then as we get more and more program managers, more of our funding will be coming through the design of those programs. This is great. Questions?
And I still have a bunch too. And we have a bunch from online.
Oh.
Thanks. So I wonder if you could say more about what you said about the awardee. I forget the term that
Performers.
you used. The performers. Mm-hmm. The relationship between the performer and the partner. You were. I think you were saying that you wanted that relationship to be set up either very early on or even at the get-go. I mean, is that, in my mind, it seems like the easiest way to get there would be to, I don't know, you have an entity like a company that has like a platform side and an applied side, and you split the company and you have the platform side that comes and applies for the award, and then they partner with the applied side. But I don't know if that's what you were thinking.
Yeah, I think, the example you gave, I don't think you'd even have to split like that way. I think you could apply as a team and make the case that you as an organization have that full pathway to commercialization. What I was sort of had in mind were groups that were potentially more academic, potentially smaller biotech, that didn't have either a commercial partner, like a venture capitalist that could take them to a later round of funding, or the regulatory relationships they need. So when I talk about starting with those other partners in mind, I'll tie a couple things together. One is at the project kickoff, we want to have the relevant FDA person there, especially if there's some confusion around what success looks like and what if there needs to be some regulatory science done alongside the program to establish the measurement. So we want those representatives at the kickoff talking about their concerns, talking about what they're looking for. Before we even pick the performers, we actually, as program managers, should be talking to those individuals and designing the metrics of the program around that. So by the time you see an announcement, hopefully they've already been, on our side trying to think through what evidence needs to be generated. The other thing I want to tie together is a hub and spoke. I spoke mostly about what's called our customer experience hub, and that is where we're trying to get a very broad swath of the American public accessible to us through a combination of trial sites and decentralized science can be a part of that. The other hub is the Investor Catalyst Hub. And so that's a mechanism for us to bring venture capitalists along, hear where they're afraid to fund, hear what type of evidence they want to see, and if we launch something that's relevant, then to bring those partners into the room for the kickoff as well. So that's sort of hopefully where we can add some value and where we can lean on the networks that you've established, but also lean on some of the infrastructure that we're building.
Thank you.
Okay. So going back, question? We just need to give you a mic so people online can hear.
So you mentioned a 3-page LOI or abstract, essentially. Is that evaluation iterative, or do you throw one over the fence and it either gets accepted or not?
So we actually had a similar conversation about this for the program manager as well. I would think of it as a no or a maybe. So if it's a maybe, then it is a very iterative process. And oftentimes the way that goes for ARPA-H is to say, hey, you put something really ambitious out there, it has a lot of components, you give them like a rough magnitude on the cost. I think these 3 of the 5 components are particularly relevant at this time. Could you flesh out the budget more? Could you turn that into a proposal? And then you kind of negotiate from there with some awareness of what we're interested in rather than blindly developing something long, comprehensive. But there is a chance of a no. And it's the same thing for a program manager where it just might not be the right fit. It might not be the right, because we don't have the right staff on board or from an ambition perspective or because it overlaps with another government agency. But if it is a maybe, if there's some signal there, then it becomes an iterative process. And it's the same for the program manager application where you come in with a 3-page set of what the Heilmeyer questions answered, as well as a list of a few other ideas to show that you can think a little bit more broadly.
So I asked earlier about examples of big DARPA successes, and since we have the longevity community here and a lot of leaders from it, I was curious if you guys have, when you and I were talking about prepping for this, we talked about possible Shark Tank style situation, and maybe we'll have time tomorrow to do that, but I was wondering if anyone here wanted to even try and pitch in one sentence a high-level idea just so we can get a pulse check on if we're thinking in the right way.
Okay, I'm just going to try this. So recently there's been a company founded partially by Michael Levin called Morphoceuticals. They have like relatively small funding, and they are translating the limb regeneration that they've successfully seen in, I think, frogs into mammals. They are quite happy with their early results, but they also think that it needs more infrastructure to set up. So basically, this is something where I'd be like very happy if this goes from like 7 million to like 100 million and more from like an academic perspective. So yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I can do the reframing from an ARPA perspective. So if I were trying to pitch something like that to an ARPA, I would focus on, you can use the company as an example, but I would start with the problem framing, right? So limb regeneration is not a capability that's available to humans today. We think that now is the right time to tackle limb regeneration because of XYZ. We think that current approaches to do so are not going to get us there because they're not going to solve these fundamental questions or these applied questions. And looking at roadmaps for companies that are operating in a kind of a resource-constrained way, that's going to be a 10, 20-year journey. We can turn that into a 5-year journey if we do ABC. So that would be kind of the reframing. It's, what's the problem? What's the signal that there's something there? And what are we going to do in a time-bound way with a budget of X, $100 million, to make demonstration of why? But I think that level of ambition, limb regeneration is something that is really exciting. We've heard people talk about organ regeneration, and that's been an example that's been on our website for some time. And DARPA has worked quite a bit on smart prosthetics that are resilient over time and able to do two-way communication, so giving you sense as well as control. And I think that's very much in the same spirit as what you're talking about.
I'll throw one over the fence. So as we age, one of the things that happens is that we experience cognitive decline, right? We tell the same story twice, we forget words. There is some evidence that how the brain wires, so neural network communication, is what is slipping as we age, right? So there's neurodegeneration, but certainly the way the brain wires together has been shown to be play a major role. It is a project I suppose one could suggest is, or I would suggest, is small molecule compounds that reverse that neural network communication decline. Is that something that would be of interest to ARPA?
I want to be careful not to try to represent ARPA, right? Because I'm not on the, I wouldn't be reviewing your application in either of those dimensions. I guess what I can say is we are really excited about novel ways to tackle issues that people think are intractable. So if you think that it is the right time to go after a small molecule approach to restoring this neural wiring capability, and you have a strong mechanistic explanation. Again, you don't need piles and piles of data that pharma needs, right? But can you make a case by analogy, by demonstration, or from first principles that this is worth us trying, and if we try, it's going to have an outsized impact? I think that that's the kind of story you'd have to tell. And what you're describing there, there may be questions about blood-brain barrier. There may be questions about some of the innovation around non-invasive approaches to stimulate brain wiring, and you'd have to kind of justify why would it be small molecule and not some of the other technologies that are being featured this week during this week's conference. But I think, again, if it's something that wouldn't work today, if you just want to pitch it to a VC, but it's because of horizon and ambition, not because it doesn't make sense, then it could be a good fit for ARPA-H.
Okay, while James brings mics around, quick question, and then we'll go back to, actually, go for it. Let's stay on topic. There's so many.
So the world looks at the healthcare system under the big three: heart attacks, cancer, and diabetes. And that's about 1.5 trillion to 1.3 trillion, depending on how you look at the markets. Those are the largest things there's currently a pharmaceutical solution for. So there's a lot of advertisement. It's sexy because they can give it a pill. The largest impact to the healthcare system globally is actually osteoporosis. That's between $5 and $6.5 trillion. And so at the rate of current increase, we're at a global epidemic where that may be worse to humanity over the next decade than anything else we've ever faced. To compound that, we held still as a race for 2 years. And for somebody to come up with a solution for that, would that be something you guys would want to look at?
Yeah, I think it's all in the particulars, right? But I think the problem framing makes a lot of sense. It actually is part of the driving force for our first program. So Nitro is primarily an osteoarthritis program, right? So that you're looking specifically at joints and the degeneration there. But in the process, one of the technical areas is I think subchondral bone. So how do you do that restoration to joints that are in poor shape, but there's something to restore? And for individuals who have nothing left to restore, can you grow an ex vivo graft bone implant rather than a titanium implant? So I think there's a precedent for that type of work. And what's I think also important about that is you do see differences in racial outcomes and demographic outcomes. And if that's the case, that can also be helpful for the second component of our mission, which is sort of the for everyone piece.
So we're currently doing that. We have 185 locations in 11 countries. Our last test had 140 individuals in it. We increased bone density by an average of 15% over 9 months. The piece that we're looking for is additional growth and research. Is that something that you guys would go into also?
So I think as an established organization, probably the best route in would be to apply to the open broad agency announcement, but also reach out to the program manager for Nitro. So that's Ross Urich. And he's, has that surgery background and also is able to give, through other vehicles like SBIRs and STTRs, awards to companies. So I think the advantage you have is there is someone on the inside, on our side, that has a program that's public, that it's at least adjacent. So I think it's something to definitely lean into.
Thank you.
Out of curiosity, and I think I asked you this, and the answer is interesting enough that I'd like it to be shared. What about people who may not have a science or tech background or don't have experience handling and deploying hundreds of millions of dollars? Yeah, so I don't think we expect too many people who've had experience handling that much money. I think it's a pretty unique role. And I mean, to be clear, it's still a government role. There's still controls in place. It's a lot of autonomy, but there are also
budget people, contracting people, making sure that it's going in the right direction, in the right structure. I think the reason that we highlight that set of attributes is that they're a little bit more about how willing you are to get into the details, right? And the details for some programs may be scientific, though you'll also have technical contractors that come along with you that you can build out your team with. But sometimes those details are more about the business side, about translational questions, about building a community, especially for things like the decentralized science and thinking through how you might incentivize new hubs and networks. So what we're looking for is the right idea and the right person. So it has to be both. And I think that's a difference from a lot of other application processes where maybe you do a case study or something, but really what they're evaluating is you and your background. Here they're looking for the person plus the idea. And the idea does have to tie in some ways to something that a team would trust you to do, but you do have a team around you. And we are certainly excited about people who are applying without traditional PhD or MD backgrounds. I think one of our recent program manager hires is a hacker by training. So he's working on health cybersecurity and thinking about how you could systematically make these tools more secure. And that isn't served by somebody necessarily having done a PhD in computer science, right? And I think that'll be the case as we tackle areas that are more emerging, that you may not have come down that track. And it's also going to be important when the challenge isn't purely technological. That being said, we are an innovation agency. So if you're looking in somewhere that's not pure hardcore science, there still has to be a clear innovation in that domain that you're working from. And hopefully your background can support you leading a project in that space.
Yeah, so I was just wondering about how the actual intellectual property would work here. Because, like, say somebody has an idea and there's no IP established or no organization established yet, and then they think they can develop it to a point where they can get it into the clinic. But once you get it into the clinic, it needs like $200 million to get into people, right? So who, and then after the 3 years, like, you have turnover of the program manager, right? So if the original person holds the IP, they may be hostile to the new program manager. So do they not hold the IP at all, or how does this happen?
No, so this is also going to be kind of negotiated on a program basis, but the government policy around IP is something that we still tend to operate under unless we set out terms that have some other set of constraints. But if you look at an NIH model, the NIH doesn't hold IP for work that they fund externally. The difference there is they have some internal labs, and that's why you might have seen things in the news about NIH IP used in mRNA vaccines. That's because those were NIH researchers. If you come in as a program manager, there's a very clear, and this is part of being government, separation and financial conflict of interest set of issues. So you won't, especially as a PM, be holding that IP. That'll sit with the companies, or if you've negotiated some other arrangement, that could make sense, but it's certainly not going to sit with the PM because they're meant to be, after they structure it, the person who helps hold the bar on performance. So that shouldn't be introducing that sort of constraint. Does that answer your question?
I don't know if this, I was a little late to the program, so I don't know if you covered this or not, but 2 questions. 1, do you fund nonprofits? And 2, would you be interested in innovation in the education sphere?
So we definitely fund nonprofits. I mean, I think technically universities are nonprofits, but I think we fund all types of organizations and expect, especially for things that are more patient-facing, that there may be patient advocacy groups that are part of the interdisciplinary teams that get funded. I think from an education perspective, it's a question of kind of the maturity of what you're describing. Like, is it a question, is what you'd be proposing on the education side, hey, we have this curriculum and we just want to teach more people that curriculum? And that sort of scale-up effort probably isn't the right fit for us. But if somebody were to come to us and say, hey, you know, the reason that our health system is not resilient is because we have tremendous turnover of nurses. Can we develop a set of tools to quickly reskill and upskill nurses and this is what the first proof of concept would look like. This is why it's new. It's leaning into new cognitive science approaches. I'm obviously just riffing this off the top of my head, but if you were thinking about innovation in education, as long as you can make that linkage to making the system more resilient or making care delivery more scalable, then I could imagine, at least which offices you would pitch that to.
So one more question in the crowd, and then I have a couple more questions. Just so you know, if you have ideas or you want us to help review your application or an idea for an application, we have a partner also that will help kind of basically filter it out and provide guidance on the high-level questions. So feel free to reach out to us. My email is just stephanie@lifespan.io. But I know you have your contact information available as well. One more question here, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, this is another moral hazard question. So as a startup founder, it doesn't sound like you're funding existing companies, correct?
So we can fund existing companies as part of, in two ways. One is that you apply directly to us through the open broad agency announcement, which is unconstrained. It has a few examples of areas that we're seeing a lot of innovation, but it's fundamentally, you bring the idea to us, and depending on how much budget envelope we have, and whether it's exciting and there's the right person in-house, then we could support it. And so that's unconstrained, right? And then the other pathway is, if there's a program manager that has a program in the area that you're working in, they'll lay out their specifications, they'll lay out the goals, and you'll decide as a startup, does me getting funded to accomplish those goals push my company forward in a meaningful way? So, the example is Moderna in the DARPA era was focused on cancer vaccines, and they had to make a decision. It's like, hey, there's an award to really advance and do a proof of concept on mRNA vaccines, but it's an infectious disease. Do we take that pathway because it's non-dilutive funding?
No, I don't want to cut you off. My point is, my final point is that, so if you are in the private sector, you take a $1 million seed round, for instance, and now you're set on your burn, right? And somebody looks at your idea, essentially pitches, does not already have a startup, right? And goes through the program, and now could potentially have $10 million or $100 million. And now it would present this sort of hazard where the government's funding a competition to a first mover in the private sector. So I'm curious how you deal with that sort of issue.
So a really important part of the program development process is that landscaping, right? So we will really equip the program manager to understand the full constellation of people that are already playing in the space. And I think in an ideal world, that person will be talking to you as they're developing their application, because they want to make sure that there are people out there who could do the work, and you want to make sure that the government's aware of the people that are doing the work. So it's not that the PM would come in and give $10 million to someone else. They would come in, frame a challenge, informed by who's out there and who can do the work, and hopefully that makes sense as something for you to apply to. Like the PM isn't forming a company, right? Like they're coming in and they're posting an announcement for awards, and the people who already have some work that they've done are going to be really compelling applicants. So you should think of it as more money in your area that you can apply for, and if it doesn't fit your business model, then maybe you don't apply for it. But it's not that the government is specifically standing up competitors to you. I think it's, if you're a first mover in that space, that's probably going to be a point of evidence that the PM uses to say, hey, if I put this award out there, there's a reason that I think this can be done in 3 years. Like somebody's already gone and built the infrastructure, somebody else has already built a team, there's somebody's already done the basic science. So you would be a data point in why the government would fund. Does that help?
I think that's really a necessary clarification, because
Yeah.
it isn't Shark Tank. This is very different.
No, it's really, at the end, it is still the government supporting innovators that are in the US ecosystem with taxpayer dollars to hopefully unblock big barriers in science and make things sustainable.
So one other thing I wanted to ask you, but I think we can follow up on this on a virtual conversation that we'll host on a Twitter space or something, but just so everyone knows, is when applying for a PM position, what are the most common mistakes people make and how can they address them while preparing to apply? And we'll give tangible examples of good and bad applications because, I've spoken with Tom Khalil from Schmidt Futures. I've talked to people who helped spin out ARPA from DARPA, and there are plenty of people who pitch and they get turned down because of the framing. And so those Hylam or catechism questions are absolutely critical, and they're not always intuitive. It's almost like you have to learn how to answer them properly, which we want to support everyone with. So we'll get back to that one. A couple questions online. So these are connected. So you said ARPA-H is disease agnostic. How do you make space for intervention in aging, which would prevent, delay, or reverse multiple diseases of aging rather than one in isolation? And connected to that question is, rejuvenation biotechnology was historically considered fringe. But that image has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. What is the perception of ARPA-H when it comes to a proposal to address the aging process itself?
So I think the two good related questions. So when I say that we're disease agnostic, what that means is that we're not organized like NIH, where we have heart, lung, blood, eye, cancer. It's ARPA-H. The four focus areas I described, you could imagine a lot of technologies fitting there, right? If you're talking about proactive health, it could be diagnostics, it could be rejuvenation, it could be tackling anything that prevents someone from going down a path of decline. So I think in that sense, aging has a little bit of a leg up because you can make that impact story. It's challenging, right? Because not all those linkages are drawn yet, and that's something the field's still working out. But it's definitely not a barrier to be focused on aging as long as you can then tie that to health outcomes that are measurable or proxy biomarkers or whatever the right metric is for the timescale of your program. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Rejuvenation is an example of proactive health. Whether it's fringe or not will depend on who you talk to at ARPA-H, but I think that it's certainly in scope, and I know our deputy director and others have been excited about going to the root of aging. So you have that leadership level alignment, but then it's still up to the details of how you complete your HQs and the evidence you have and why you think it's the right time.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with this audience?
So I think it's a really unique time to partner with us. In the short term, I think getting your ideas down on 3 pages, sending it over, seeing if there's interest, hopefully a lightweight way to do it. The program manager process is intensive. I know there's folks here who are going through it and are going through that refinement, and that can be challenging. So it does take time and investment, but it is a leveling up opportunity. So you do get good feedback. I've talked to candidates who've thought about, what would it look like now that I've gotten this feedback to go pitch this as a startup or think about how this has refined their thinking. So hopefully the process of reframing, and that gets to your question that we might tackle later, away from, hey, I'm an individual entrepreneur or an individual PI, and hey, I want to move the field forward, and what is the budget and the milestone that's going to take us there. It's a mindset shift, but hopefully it's one that lets you work with the broader community. And we've seen particularly candidates who've brought along a lot of experts and subject matter partners to try to work interdisciplinary ways. So that's not at all discouraged. So, if you want to, think about other folks whose input you want to get, if you want to kind of represent a broader community as you present, you're coming in as an individual, but it's an exciting time, and sometimes it's helpful to kind of coalesce around a few big ideas and get them in front of ARPA-H.
This has been fantastic. Clearly, this community is interested and curious, and we're really grateful that you're here today. We'll follow up. You're here tomorrow?
I'm here tomorrow.
Okay. So you can find Arunan walking around, and Lifespan will be in touch, and we'll probably do something else afterwards to continue answering questions and helping to facilitate this process for people who are interested in clarifying things as well. Big round of applause for Arunan. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Guys, let's change the world. This is a new government agency department. Let's take advantage of it.